In the final months of the Second World War, as the Pacific conflict reached its brutal climax, a strange and desperate weapon began appearing in Allied intelligence reports. Small, fast, packed with explosives. A weapon so dangerous its own operators rarely expected to survive the mission. The Japanese called them Shinoyo, explosive motorboats designed for one purpose: to ram Allied warships at high speed. But one night in 1945, during the chaotic battles around the Philippines, one of these so-called suicide weapons did something few believed possible. It struck a warship moving at nearly 30 knots. Moments later, a heavily armed Japanese destroyer disappeared beneath the waves. How could a tiny wooden boat, barely larger than a fishing craft, destroy a vessel weighing more than 2,000 tons? To understand what happened that night, we must return to January 1945. During the desperate fighting in the Philippine Islands, when Japan's naval power was collapsing, and new terrifying tactics were born out of sheer desperation, because what happened next would become one of the most unusual and little-known naval incidents of the war. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former strength. Just 3 years earlier, the Japanese fleet had swept across the Pacific with devastating force. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers had dominated the seas from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. But by 1945, that power had been shattered. American submarines were strangling Japan's shipping lanes. Carrier air groups roamed the skies uncontested. One by one, the Imperial Navy's major warships had been sunk. During the catastrophic Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan lost much of what remained of its surface fleet. The defeat was devastating. Fuel shortages crippled the Navy. Replacement ships were almost impossible to build under relentless American bombing. And yet the war was far from over. To defend the homeland and the remaining occupied territories, Japan began turning toward unconventional weapons. The world would soon hear about the kamikaze pilots, young aviators who deliberately crashed explosive-filled aircraft into Allied ships. But fewer people know that Japan also developed suicide boats. These vessels were known as Shinoyo, meaning seaquake. Built primarily of wood and powered by a simple gasoline engine, the Shinoyo boats could reach speeds of 30 knots or more. Each carried a massive 250-kilogram explosive charge mounted in the bow. The idea was brutally simple. The operator would steer directly into an enemy warship. At the moment of impact, the explosive charge would detonate. In theory, the pilot could escape at the last second. In reality, very few ever did. By late 1944, hundreds of these boats had been deployed across the Philippines, particularly in the maze of islands and narrow channels where large warships were forced to maneuver carefully. And on the night of January 10, 1945, one such boat would cross paths with a Japanese destroyer during a chaotic naval engagement. An encounter no one expected. The destroyer Harusame had already survived years of brutal naval combat. Commissioned in 1937, she was part of the Shiratsuyu-class destroyers, fast and heavily armed ships designed to escort fleets and launch devastating torpedo attacks. Displacing more than 2,000 tons, Harusame carried powerful Type 93 long lance torpedoes, 127mm naval guns, and anti-aircraft batteries. She had fought in numerous Pacific campaigns. From the Solomon Islands to the Philippines, Harusame had dodged bombs, torpedoes, and submarines. But by 1945, her mission had changed. Japan's remaining destroyers were now tasked with escort duties and emergency transport operations, shuttling troops and supplies between isolated garrisons. On January 10th, Harusame was operating near Mindoro Island, part of the central Philippines. The region had become extremely dangerous. American forces had recently landed on Mindoro to establish airfields that would support the upcoming invasion of Luzon. Naval vessels, including destroyers like Harusame, were ordered to conduct nighttime operations under constant threat from American aircraft and submarines. That evening, the weather was calm. A thin layer of clouds hung over the dark water. Visibility was limited. Perfect conditions for small attack craft. At 2100 hours, Harusame was moving at high speed along the coast. Her engines pushed the destroyer through the water at nearly 30 knots. Lookouts scanned the horizon. Anti-aircraft gunners watched the sky. But no one aboard Harusame was expecting the threat that was about to appear. Because somewhere in the darkness, a small Shinoyo explosive boat was already in motion. Its engine growled quietly as it cut across the water. Inside the cramped cockpit sat a single operator. He knew the mission: steer straight at the target, detonate the explosive charge, and accept whatever fate followed. These men were often young, barely out of training. Many had written farewell letters before climbing aboard their fragile wooden boats. By 2130 hours, the small boat was moving through the dark water just offshore. Its operator had likely spotted the destroyer's silhouette first. A massive shape cutting across the sea. Harusame. At that moment, the tiny craft accelerated. Its engine screamed as the throttle opened. The speed climbed. 20 knots. 25. 30. The operator aimed directly toward the destroyer. On board Harusame, the crew remained unaware. Lookouts focused on aircraft and submarines, not small wooden boats barely visible in the darkness. Then suddenly, one of the forward lookouts shouted, a shape on the water, fast, closing rapidly, just 200 yards away. Alarm bells rang across the ship, searchlights snapped on, the beam cut across the water, and illuminated the incoming craft, a tiny boat, racing directly toward them. For the crew of Harusame, the situation became critical in seconds. The destroyer's gunners reacted instantly. Machine guns opened fire, tracers streaked across the darkness. The deafening rattle of automatic weapons echoed over the water. The Shinoyo operator did not change course. He drove straight ahead. The destroyer's crew could clearly see the explosive charge mounted on the boat's bow. Some sailors later recalled seeing the silhouette of the operator gripping the controls. Fear gripped the men aboard the destroyer. They knew what this meant. If that boat struck the hull at full speed, the explosion could rip open the ship's side. Rounds struck the water around the boat, but the tiny craft kept coming. At 100 yards, Harusame's captain ordered a hard turn. The destroyer began to swing to port, attempting to evade the attack. But physics was against them. A ship weighing thousands of tons cannot turn instantly. The Shinoyo operator adjusted his course, still aiming for the hull, still accelerating. Just 50 yards away, tracers slammed into the water and into the boat. Some reports suggest the craft may have been damaged, but it never slowed. Then, impact. The Shinoyo boat struck the destroyer near the stern, just below the waterline. A split second later, the explosive charge detonated. The blast was enormous. A violent shockwave tore through the hull. Flames shot upward, metal twisted, wood shattered. For a moment, the entire stern of Harusame lifted violently out of the water. Water began flooding into the engine compartments. Lights flickered across the ship. Men were thrown to the deck. Others were hurled against bulkheads by the force of the blast. And suddenly the destroyer began to slow. Smoke and fire filled the air. Immediately after the explosion, Harusame's engines began to fail. Flooding spread rapidly through the lower compartments. Seawater surged into the machinery spaces. Within minutes, the destroyer lost power. She drifted helplessly in the dark water. Damage control crews fought desperately to contain the flooding. Pumps were activated. Emergency bulkheads were sealed. Men worked in smoke-filled compartments as cold seawater poured through the shattered hull. But the damage was too severe. One engine room was completely flooded. Another was rapidly filling. Without propulsion, Harusame could no longer maneuver. Worse still, the ship's hull had begun to break apart under the stress of the damage. The destroyer was dying. Orders were given to prepare life rafts and abandon ship. Crew members continued fighting the flooding for as long as possible, but within an hour, the situation became hopeless. The sea slowly claimed the crippled destroyer. The stern settled lower and lower. Water rushed across the deck. Then, with a slow and terrible motion, Harusame began to sink. Some crew members jumped into the water. Others climbed into rafts. Moments later, the destroyer slipped beneath the surface. Gone. A warship that had survived years of combat had been destroyed by a single explosive boat. A weapon smaller than a fishing vessel. A weapon many had dismissed as desperate and ineffective. But that night proved otherwise. The sinking of Harusame demonstrated the frightening potential of small suicide attack craft. Though most Shinoyo attacks during the war failed or were intercepted, incidents like this showed that even the largest warships could be vulnerable to determined attackers using unconventional tactics. The destroyer's crew suffered casualties during the explosion and sinking. Many survivors were later rescued by nearby Japanese vessels. For Japan, the use of Shinoyo boats became part of a broader strategy of asymmetric warfare during the final months of the conflict. Thousands of these boats were constructed and deployed across the Pacific. Yet despite their potential, they rarely achieved decisive results. Allied forces soon adapted. Warships increased patrols, improved radar detection, and deployed small escort craft specifically designed to intercept suicide boats before they could approach. Still, the destruction of Harusame remained a chilling example of how even a tiny weapon, in the right moment, could change the fate of a powerful warship. It also reflected the tragic reality of the war's final phase. Young men sent on missions with little hope of survival. Weapons built not for defense, but for sacrifice. And the brutal determination of a nation fighting against inevitable defeat. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.